Hey guys, Richard Holden here. We are live. I know it's not 7 o'clock. It's actually 6 o'clock or a little after 6:14 or so, but I want to get started early. I got a bunch of stuff I got to get done tonight. If you guys haven't seen it, I've already posted a video. I just posted it up on some 5-liter Ford stuff, which obviously I have a soft spot in my heart because I still have a 1988 5-liter LX Mustang. And that's a very cool car. I bought it new, so I've had it for, since November of 1987. And it's yet to have a turbo in it and have it drive it around. I drove it around a long time with a Vortex Supercharger on it, about 85,000 miles, before I ended up pulling that motor out, and we ran a bunch of testing with it at West Tech. So that was, I think, if I remember right, and I'd have to verify this with those guys, that may have been the first fuel injected motor that they ran at West Tech. This was long ago. So, but it was fun stuff. And I have always wanted a turbo in that car because after looking at the average power production of a centrifugal blower versus a turbo combination, having the only thing better than having 6 or 8 or 10 pounds of boost at the top of the RPM range is having that much boost through the whole curve when the turbo comes up. So as soon as I discovered all of that stuff and learned that, it was kind of a cool deal. So I am excited about that, but that video is cool. And basically it talks about, would you rather take a motor and make some mild modifications on it? Like if this applies to more than just a 5-liter Ford, it also applies to the LS. So would you rather just put minor modifications on it like cam and springs, and then run the boost up to make the power, or would you like other modifications? It's not as necessary on an LS application because you already have a good intake manifold, you have good cylinder heads if you go get a 4.8 or a 5.3, and really all that they need is a camshaft. But on a 5-liter, they're not blessed the way that the LS is. It doesn't really have very good cylinder heads. The other option with that is to go not to start with a 5-liter Ford Mustang with a Mustang engine, but start with an Explorer engine. So if you start with that, then you have a little bit better cylinder head in the GT40. You could put a cam in it, or you could go whole hog and then put a set of airflow research heads or RHS heads like we tested, or 11R heads from TFS. There's a lot of good choices for the Ford stuff. If you haven't seen them, I've got videos up right now on the various tests that I ran on all of the Ford heads. So you can see what they all do, but there's a lot of good choices out there. But unfortunately, the 5-liter Ford was blessed with heads that only flow 160 or so CFM. And that compares to like an LS that might have heads that flow 230, 240, 250 CFM. So they're quite a bit better than a 5-liter Ford. So the 5-liter Ford needs the head. So that's the question, is in that video, would you spend the money to upgrade the things that you need on the 5-liter Ford, or simply just turn up the boost because the boost is it's an easier thing to do. So if you have a whole bunch of boost in reserve, it costs nothing to turn it up. But you have to also think about, well, as I'm turning up the boost, instead of running 7 pounds or 8 pounds or 9 pounds or whatever it takes on a modified motor, I might have to run 13 or 14 or 15 pounds. But again, if you have the intercooler and you have the fuel and you have the tuning, you can obviously make that work, and it works just fine. We've run lots of boost on stuff. I have for years and years and years been more on the other side of things. I've always liked making as much NA power as you can, especially in the case of a 5-liter Ford, because like I said, they were not blessed like the LS is with really good cylinder heads. So, we always did some fairly big modifications on the 5-liter. So if you had a 5-liter, putting a good set of heads, a cam, and an intake manifold was kind of a natural thing. And especially because I had a Vortex, so we wanted to make better power NA and then add the boost to it, and that works really good. And it works equally well with the turbo. So I was always kind of on that side of it. But now, in looking back, I think, well, that might not be necessary. Would a supercharger cam help? Actually, as I said, any cam is a turbo cam, and every cam is a supercharger cam too. The cam that we use on the 5-liter Ford is that Extreme Energy 274, a 224, 232, which, by the way, is a good duration split for LS motors and Dodge motors and big buck Chevys and all kinds of stuff. So that's a good go-to version. And that particular camshaft, I remember doing this test on the Ford stuff, where we ran that camshaft. I ran it NA, we ran it with nitrous, we ran it with a supercharger, a centrifugal blower, and we also ran it with a turbo. And guess what? It works on all those combinations because it's just a cam and it doesn't really know that it has boost or that it doesn't have boost. And if it makes more power NA, it will also make more power under boost, which is what you're looking for from a camshaft. And on the 5-liter Ford, we were never looking to like run maximum power, because we knew that we could always, especially with the turbo, and to some extent with a centrifugal blower, we could always make more power than we thought the block could withstand, or at least the other internal components, because a lot of times we ran stock stuff. So we could never make as much power as we could, or as the block we thought would take. So we could always exceed that. So we were never worried about, oh, do I kind of get a little bit more out of a 282 cam instead of a 274, or any of that stuff. So that's what that video is about. It's about the decision between, should I modify this and spend a bunch of money. The nice thing now, as compared to way back when I did the cylinder head test, is that the availability of like the offshore stuff, the inexpensive cylinder heads, there weren't a lot of inexpensive cylinder heads back when I did that first test. There are lots of them now. So you can go get any number of fairly inexpensive aluminum heads, and obviously I would recommend an aluminum head over a cast iron head any day of the week. Only just if for no other reason than I just don't want to lift it up and carry it around, and especially to put it up and airflow test it and all that stuff. And a small block Ford head is not really very heavy, even an iron one. But if you're dealing with big block heads, or Hemi heads or those kinds of things, iron heads are just not a good idea. So I would recommend aluminum head. There are some that I've tested that I would not recommend. Not because the head or the port is not good. A lot of times the low buck aftermarket heads don't have good valves in them. They don't have good seats in them. They don't have valves that want to stay together and seats that want to stay in, nor do they usually have, a lot of them don't have good valve springs. We've done some tests on some where we've run valve springs on them. And when we measured them before we put them on, because we did that, we took the heads apart, measured the spring, go, okay, yeah, that's about what we need for our hydraulic roller cam. And then after breaking the motor in and running it a few times, we started noticing that valve float would happen earlier and earlier. And what was happening is the springs were going away. So we took the springs off and measured them again. And sure enough, they had lost a ton of like spring rate. All of a sudden, they were 25 pounds down from where they were when we first measured them. So even though they had the correct spring rate to begin with, when we were, and we weren't even done. I mean, we're talking about running them up to temperature during the break-in and making a few pulls up to 5,000 or 6,000 RPM, and then they were done. So if you're going to go the low dollar route, there are some that I hadn't tested that might work just fine. There are some that I have tested that have worked fine. And there are others that I've tested that I would not run without replacing all of that stuff. One of the heads that comes to mind that has worked is I've run the Pro Max stuff, and that's worked very well. I've tested their big block stuff. We've tested their small block Ford stuff. And I'm thinking that we may have tested also their small block Chevy stuff, but I can't recall. But I know we tested the big block Chevy stuff, and that worked very well. And if you take a look at the 496 video I have that's up with the Procharger on it, it made good power, obviously, and with a blower, it's fairly easy to do. And I know that we've tested their Ford stuff because we've run that a bunch, and both of those worked very well. So there are a lot of good ones out there that make good power, but beware if you're trying to buy the ultra low dollar head, it might not have good components in it. So take a look at that. Look at the Ford video. There's nothing better than running a boosted 5-liter, boosted L. Anything that's boosted obviously is a good thing. So we can take, if you guys haven't taken a look at that, make sure you go take a look at it, and hopefully we can answer some questions. Maybe because I started early, it doesn't seem like there's as many people here right now, but maybe more guys will come. Let's see. I know it's off topic, but do I need to add ring gap on an LS53 for 5.5 pounds of boost? Probably not. I always add ring gap because not very many people stay at 5.5 pounds. Let's see. Come on, focus. Not very many people stay there. If you're only going to run 5.5 pounds, it probably would be okay. And we've run 300 shots on junkyard motors where we haven't changed the ring gap at all. We've run boost on them where we haven't changed the ring gap at all. Lots of guys have. The problem that I have is you just don't know. You don't know what the gap is, and you don't know how little it is or how big it is. And if you check it, you know, and if you're going to check it, yeah, you might as well change it anyways. Francisco said he just built an LQ4 with a sloppy stage 2 cam at 862 heads. So that thing's got to be fairly torquey. That'd be a good combination. Have you got to play with the new AFR heads? I assume you're talking about the ASCAS Enforcers. I haven't run those yet. John wants to see a 5-liter Coyote. I have some Coyote videos up, and I do like those motors. They make good power. I haven't run one of the later generations, but I did a lot of Gen 1 stuff. Chris wants to know if an AFR 165 Renegade head would be good for 500 to 600 horsepower and 302 with a turbo. That would be easy. I mean, that head will support a lot of power NA. It would you would be, you know, more than 2/3 of the way to the power level that you're at just NA with a 302 and that head on there. So it would work good. The D-Animal wants to know, how are the SVE heads? I don't know what SVE heads are. Are you talking about the Ford racing heads? If you take a look at any of the videos I have, I think there's 3 of them up right now. I haven't put the 4th one up, but there's lots of the GT40, GT40P head, the GT40 aluminum head, the GT40X. Almost all of the Ford racing heads are up there. Tom's in the house. I just got on, but you're talking push rods. We're not talking push rods right now. We're talking turbos. Karen Ashcraft, when I start dreaming about Coyote swap foxes, I sober up when I start looking at the prices. You can swap in a truck 5-liter for much less money than you can a Mustang Coyote. So that's cheaper, but it's not. A lot of guys talk about how cheap swaps are. Even an LS swap is not a totally inexpensive thing. I mean, yeah, I can go get a motor for a few $100s, but in a real swap, you have to do a lot more than that. The motor is not a hard part. Karen, I'm going to build my 5.3 stage 1 cam and GT35, a GT35 82 turbo on a 5.3. That's a really small turbo for that. That's like a 500 or 600 horsepower turbo. And it's going to be really responsive, although that turbo on a 5.3 is going to have fairly high back pressure if you're only using a single. Matthew wants to know if I've run a 351 with stock heads, an Edelbrock dual plane intake, and an Edelbrock AVS2 carb. I haven't run that exact setup. When we ran our 351 from the wrecking yard, we did run it with a dual plane. It probably was an Edelbrock, if I remember right, but it probably was a like a Holley 650 or something that we ran on there. And I think it made 260 or so horsepower the way that we set it up from the wrecking yard. Francisco wants to know what kind of engine I have in my daily. My daily is a 2002 Chevy Silverado 4-wheel drive. It is a bone stock 5.3. Carlos wants to know, on 5 liters, are you able to buy a valley girdle to prevent the block from splitting? No, I don't think the valley girdle stops that. It might help a little bit, but it's not going to prevent the block from splitting. I know, Nick Nasty, it's not 7 p.m. I told you guys yesterday I was going to be doing this at 6. We were going to starting early, so I'll probably go through 7 a little bit, but not that much. I wanted to get started earlier. Trigger is still waiting on the Turbo 306. Me too. I'm really, really excited about doing an intake manifold on that one. I'm excited about doing the intake manifold on that one and also on the V10 Ford, the Triton V10. Kyle wants to know what would be a good turbo setup for around 375 wheel horsepower on a 5-liter. The GT35 would do that, but 375 is also in the GT35 82 range or something between those two, maybe, so you could get good response. Team D Performance wants to know, and this is a very common thing, especially back in the day, how much power will I lose if I replace the upper intake portion of the GT40 with a fabricated upper one? If you get rid of all the runner length, you're going to lose power through most of the curve. Only at the very, very top will you pick up any power when you run these short runner box intakes. We did all of that stuff with Downs and Cartech and everybody else that, and Hartman had one and Comp had one. And every time I've tested the box, all it does is pick up power past 6,000 RPM. So it loses a bunch down low. Are there any benefits to running twin superchargers, roots, or centrifugals? Only if the single one cannot provide the amount of airflow and power that you're trying to make. Then twins work out. What are your thoughts on Super Rotter? What are your thoughts on thermal coating for piston tops? I think that they're a good idea, and lots of professional racing organizations use that. I've never done a back-to-back test to find out how well it works. I did do a cool test one time for the company that had a thermal coating on the top. And what we did was, after they coated the piston, we put the piston in an autoclave and melted the piston to where it was a molten puddle of aluminum, but the coating still sat there, floating around on the molten pool of aluminum. So obviously the coating is a lot tougher than the aluminum piston was, which I thought was kind of a cool deal. But that doesn't really tell us, did it add heat? Did it? I haven't taken any temperature measurements to see if we have a different amount of heat going out the exhaust rather than being retained and all that. It would help with the longevity maybe of the piston. Although now it's imparting more heat into the chamber. So, what's really happening there? John wants to know a good single turbo for 900 wheel horsepower. That's an S475, S480 range, 78, 75 Gen 2 like we ran from racing. All of those are kind of in that wheelhouse. Tom wants to know how many 5-liter blocks I've split. I've actually only ever broken one, and I didn't do it. The guys from HP Performance were doing it when we were doing a test together, where they put one of their turbo kits on a stock motor in a Mustang, went out and did and took it out to the drag strip and ran it. And the car went 1090s, and then we did modifications on it where we did it NA and we did it turbocharged. So then we put heads, cam, and intake on it, and then had the same turbo kit on it. And they took it out and took it to the chassis dyno, and then took it out and drag raced it. And when they took it out again, then split the block, and it made a lot of torque. It was in the 750 or 800 foot-pound range when they were running it. Team D, how much power loss are we looking at? I'm sure you're talking about the short intake manifold. I can try to look that up and see if I have the data. Those are pretty old tests. A lot of the stuff we might not have, but we've run lots of short runner stuff versus long runner stuff. Like if you take a look at some of the LS stuff, it's comparable too. But I'm sure that it's 30 or 40 foot-pounds down low. Spooling Ford says that you've split roller 351 blocks, stroke to 410-inch, twin 66s on E85, 12 to 18 pounds. Well, 12 to 18 pounds is a big spread. That's 100 horsepower difference and at least that much torque difference, I'm sure, between the two. Because that's 6 pounds. So 6 pounds is easily going to be more than 100 horsepower. We've run on 351 Windsor hydraulic roller blocks. We've run way over 1,000 horsepower with them on the dyno, so we know that they'll take that. I have not ever done any quick spool valves or variable vane testing. Although John Dock was here last night, and he's saying he wanted to send me 118 millimeter turbo, so it would definitely require something like that, I'm sure, to get that thing spooled up. Black Blood wants me to do 6.1, 6.4 Hemi stuff. I have some 6.1 Hemi stuff videos up right now, so I have done some testing with that. I haven't done any 6.4 Hemi stuff, though. Team D Performance wants to know if the runner length is from where the throttle body starts. No, it's not. The runner length is from inside the plenum basically down to the valve, including the head. So it's the head and the intake runner, and then when it meets into the common plenum is where the reflected wave starts and stops. So it's not the throttle body. Carlos wants to know if stock 5-liter pistons are forging from the factory. It depends on the year. On the Mustangs, they were up until, and somebody can correct me on this, I think until 93, and then maybe the SM95 stuff was not. I know my Mustang was an 88, and it had forged pistons, and they were done by TRW, if I remember right. And they took a lot. But if you take a look at, and we were all concerned about that too. Oh, forged versus, cast pistons. But now after doing the stuff that we've done with the LS motor, and those are cast pistons, they're not forged pistons. We've run 1,500 horsepower on the stock LS pistons. So I don't think that the piston strength is really what's limiting the power output of a turbo or supercharged 5-liter. Chris wants to know if I'd change the ring gap for 10 to 15 pounds of boost on a junkyard. Yes, I would. And when people, this is a pet peeve of mine, when people talk to me about boost and they're saying from 10 to 15 pounds, like that range doesn't, like those are the same. Those are not the same things. 10 to 15 pounds is 5 pounds of boost. That's more than 100 horsepower change on any kind of modified motor. That's a lot. That's a big spread. That's like saying, oh, I want to make between 900 and 1,200 horsepower at the tire. Well, those are dramatically different things. Pick something that you want so that you can focus in on that. Because if you want to make 900, that's one thing. And if you want to make 1,200, that's a whole different thing. And those are two different things. So when you're asking a question, I know that's just me, but that kind of a spread is really, really big. Joe wants to know on 351, have you ever cut out the center of the air gap intake? Yeah, I did. We did a lot of that when I did Engine Masters way back, and I think it was 2006 or 7. That was when we had 410-inch motors, and I built the 409-inch version, and I ran a dual plane on it, unlike everybody else that ran a single plane. And we had it extrude honed twice, and that was one of the other things that we did. We cut the divider out and then made our own divider and shortened it and lengthened it and put spacers and made it. And since we had a Dominator carburetor, I had a Dominator to a 4150 adapter, and then we put a divider in that. I mean, we went through, I was looking for power. So we tested everything. I assumed that I knew nothing and tested everything to find out. And the dyno and the engine would tell me what actually worked rather than the other way around. Carlos wants to know if there's more LT1 videos coming out. Yes, there are. It'll be the L99 stuff first and then LT1 stuff after that. Marv wants to know, what do you think on carb supercharge on an 85 roller 5-liter Mustang? I'm assuming you're running a carburetor with a supercharger. If that's a blow through, we normally want a blow through carburetor like from CSU. If it's a draw through, you can just use a normal carburetor on that. And all of that works. Jake wants to know how I calculate the total advance I want for performance, applying it to a locked distributor. When we run stuff on the dyno, since we're running from, let's say, 3,000 to 6,500 or something, usually the distributor is all in on a performance application by 3,000 anyway. So having it locked is not a big deal. The only problem you have usually is starting, because it has a lot of advance in it while you're trying to start it. And that's sometimes hard on it. But it's usually whatever the thing wants at the power peak, and that will determine where you're going to set the timing at, because you want to have as much power as you can, and that will do it. And then, like I said, usually it's all in by then. Looking at the fuel-injected motors that we run, we don't have the same timing at 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 as we do at 6,500. So we've been going off this locked distributor theory for a long time, and I don't know that it's ideal. I wouldn't ever do that on an LS. I'm sure of that. Ryan wants me to test different air-to-air intercoolers from small to big. I have an intercooler and tube upgrade test video up on the dyno right now, and it does make a big difference. And it makes the most difference when you're at or near the flow limit of the supercharger. And you can improve that by getting rid of a big restriction. So the more of it's a very simplistic thing, but the more of a restriction it is, the more of a change it's going to make. If it's not a restriction, then there will be no problem. But we went from, I'm thinking it was a 3-inch to a 3.5-inch inlet, and then the core was much bigger. They were both from ProCharger, and it showed some pretty big power gains and big changes in boost as well. And we didn't change anything on the blower. It was a centrifugal blower, a ProCharger, but it changed the boost in the manifold because it was probably all backing up behind the behind the intercooler. Ben wants to know, do you pick up power adding ignition back in after peak torque? Yeah, that's the way that any timing curve will look like that, even in NA. You'll want more timing at the power peak than you will at the torque peak, and then you usually want less below the torque peak. So you'll have a curve, which is like I was talking about on the LS stuff. We definitely have less timing at 2,000 RPM or 2,500 RPM than we have at the torque peak, and then we have even more at the power peak. So it might be 29 out at the power peak, it might be 24 or 25 at the torque peak, and it might be 22 or 23. Again, when we test these and tune these, what I do is we just start at a low timing and make runs and go, okay, it likes that. And then we raise everything. And then if it doesn't like it down here, we just keep it at the lower number. And then pretty soon, after we're going through all those steps and finding out what it likes, we have a built-in curve, and the dyno and the motor tell us what that curve is. Like I said, I don't ever try to tell it and go, well, I know everything about tuning and here's what you're going to like. It tells us, hey, look, it worked here and it didn't work here. It's a lot easier to listen to the motor. Tom wants to know, what was something you found out through testing that made you question the results or want to retest? There's actually been a lot of stuff. As a matter of fact, just today, it's funny you should bring that up. I was looking at the results from the 351 Windsor junkyard motor that we put the Edelbrock top end kit on it, and it made 465 or 7 or something like that. And looking back now, I think that's a lot of power. I mean, I think about small block Chevys, like 350 Chevys that we've run, doing a heads, cam, and intake upgrade on them, and I don't remember getting near that power level. So it just makes me wonder about that. And there was another test that was run at West Tech by somebody else, and I question those results all the time because I've run similar things like 5 or 6 times, and what my motors make never came close to what their motor makes. So there are lots of things that I look at and go, I would sure like to be there and do that and see what's happening. And sometimes my stuff too. And Jake wants to know how do I determine how many degrees I need to? You have to test it. You have to test it either on the dyno or test it on the street or test it at the track. You can guess and figure it out. If it's an LS, I wouldn't go more than 29 or 30 degrees or so at the power peak, and then I would do less than that. If it's a 5-liter Ford, it's probably going to want more like 35 or 36 at the top, and then less down below that, if that gives you an idea. Karen Ashcraft, your motor burns 1 quart of oil every 1,000 miles. That seems like it's a 2-stroke. A lot of the junkyard motors that we've used for the Big Bang stuff, and some of the motors that I've just used that weren't Big Bang motors, have had, I think Chad's motor had 250 something thousand miles on it. I had one that had 300 on it, and it still ran fine. It seemed to smoke a little bit when we first started it, but after that, it seemed to like get happy and go, hey, look, somebody rescued me from the wrecking yard. So now everything's going to be fine. Darth wants to know what's new with the Nova. I haven't done anything on the Nova for a little bit. I want to take it down and put a motor in it, but the reason I haven't taken it down there yet is the motor, the 6-cylinder, isn't done yet. So I'm waiting for the cylinders and intakes and all kinds of stuff. And then I actually want to put it in the car and start the car up and make it run. And I'll do lots of videos on that because there are a number of things that I have to do while I'm down there to make that happen, not just putting the motor in. You know, I have to go through getting the right clutch and flywheel and motor mounts and radiator, and we'll have to do stuff to the brakes and to the front suspension and all that stuff. And that's some of that stuff is stuff I can't really do here. It would be a lot easier to do at West Tech. Wyatt, I think your 85 motor is a roller motor. Joyce is ditching the nitrous build and going to a single rear mount turbo on your 5.4 valve BA Falcon. Awesome. So that means you must be down in Australia, which is very cool. The engine should produce 400 to 450 NA, and I'm going after 900. That should be easy. If you're going to run a single exhaust, make it big. If you have a big single turbo, I'm assuming you're going to have an S475 or an S480 size turbo. Run a big 4-inch or something. Or if you're going to run twins, you're going to split that, then split it into 2 3-inch. The more exhaust you have after the turbo, the happier the turbo is going to be. Tom, are you asking if I still have a Civic? I don't have a Civic right now. The last one that I had was the 94 Civic VX, and I gave it to my buddy Chad, and he's driving the heck out of it. He's putting lots of miles on it. He drives it everywhere. All right, Matthew, checking out. We'll send some friends over. Somebody else might know. I think all the 302, the HO motors, I think are all 50 ounce. Sean wants to know, do you set your timing for NA as you do for boost on the dyno? What we do is if we're running the Holly or fast, we have how many ever bars of, map sensors that we're running. But let's say that we're running a 2-bar map sensor, we will set, I usually run it NA, and then we'll have, like I said, if it's an LS motor, say we have 29 degrees of total timing out at the power peak. And we have, let's say we're starting at 22 and we have some kind of curve built up into that. I'll use that same curve, but then as we go up and boost, I'll reduce the timing as we go up and boost for every one of those. So it'll have the same shape of the slope, and then it will have less timing basically based on how much boost we have at each one of those RPM and load points. Garrett GT40X45, yeah, that's a real turbo. Oh, so if you're doing a rear mount, did you say that this is in a truck or something? If it's a rear mount, then you're not going to have a very long length of exhaust. So just make the exhaust big. Nick Nasty wants to know, on a Victor Jr. intake manifold, looks like the runner lengths are longer on the first and last runners. Yeah, actually what happens on a single plane typically is the 4 inner runners are shorter and the 4 outer runners are longer. And it definitely affects the power production in those cylinders. They're not making the same power at the same RPM, and also affects distribution as well. Francisco wants to know, are performance coil packs worth it, or not really too much difference? We run the factory coil packs on LS stuff. Sometimes coil upgrades are necessary, and we run ignition amplifiers usually on the dyno because we have MSDs on there. Like if we're running a distributor, small block Chevy or small block Ford or something, we run an ignition amplifier. We bring the plug gap way down to in the teens, 19 or 20 or so for running boost, just to get rid of misfire. And then the coil and ignition amplifier become more important on a distributor with a single coil than it is on an LS, because you have 8 coils and you don't have You don't have to worry about the rise time and stuff, and it makes life a lot easier. But even then, on the LS stuff, we adjust the dwell in the Holley to about 4 milliseconds or so on the stock coils that we use. Richard, would you build a 351 cleaver or a 400M? I think a cleaver would be a better way to go, just because there's probably more intakes for it. There's not a lot of intakes for a 400M unless you do adapter plates. So just from that standpoint, I think it would be better. And if you did a 351 cleaver, you could do it with a 4-inch crank and make it a 408. Tom, I don't know how we'd hook up your SR20 unless somebody makes an SR20 to small block Chevy bell housing adapter. Curtis wants to know about my opinion on Pro Max heads for the 351 Windsor. I went over that earlier, but they work good. We've tested them and they do work good. Tenor has a rear mount turbo on a 04 Crown Vic. Nice. Marv, you could get away with if you're looking for a supercharger for your Mustang, send me an email. I'm gonna put my email here. Where are the caps? I think I have most of a 5-liter Ford Vortex supercharger kit for a Mustang. So and it would be a lot less money than you're talking about there. So if that's what you're interested in, that's a good way to go. Or again, you have to decide, do I want to have if you want to do it the cheap way, you should go get GT40 heads from the junkyard, put a cam in it, put the blower on it, and you'll make a lot of power. And also, if even though you have an 85, you can go get a whole Explorer motor for a few $100s from the wrecking yard, and then that way it's fuel injected. If you want to put fuel injection on it, you could also run it carbureted. Obviously, take the intake manifold off it, but you'd have the GT40 heads, and then you wouldn't have to worry about your motor. It would be a hydraulic roller motor. It would bolt right up to your trans and all that stuff. So that's another option for you. JC wants to know, what's your opinion of the response expected of twin 7875s? Well, on a 427, they're going to be fairly good on a motor that's that big. I'm assuming that the 427 also makes good power. Tom wants the ball bearing versus thrust bearing spool test. I honestly I doubt that you would see anything on the engine dyno. I could be wrong, but I don't think that that's, if you've ever oiled those and then spun them by hand, it's really hard to feel any difference between those two. Once they're lubricated, which they are all the time, obviously when they're running, I don't think that that's what would determine spool rate. I think it's power output and exhaust flow and heat versus the opening and the turbo and the sizing of the turbo. I don't know that the bearing thing is a big deal. You want to turbocharge your 2012 2.5-liter Passat? You can do that. We did a blower kit for the old 2-liter Volkswagens that were in the NA ones that were in the Golf. We made a Vortex supercharger work on those, and it worked very well. But a turbo is easy. All you have to do is get the exhaust going to the turbo. I don't know where it mounts because I haven't looked at the engine bay of that car, but you have to mount the turbo high enough so that it will drain, run the boost to the intake manifold. Obviously, through an intercooler would be better. you have to put bigger injectors and a bigger pump in it, and then you have to also be able to tune it. So I don't know if, as long as people can tune that particular ECU, then you're okay. Sean wants to know, can you find low and mid-range torque with a short runner intake through tuning? No, that there's no amount of, I mean, we assume when I do intake manifold tests, they both have the optimized air, fuel, and timing. That's as much power as they can make. And there's still going to be a big difference in torque down low from the change in runner length. That's a reflected wave, and it adds cylinder filling in those RPM ranges. It's something you can't tune around. Longer runners will make more power in a given range compared to short runners. It's RPM specific, because what it is it's the amount of time that it takes for the reflected wave to travel up and back down the runner. So the length that it has to travel, it's traveling basically at the speed of sound. So it has to go up and back a certain distance in a given amount of time because it's traveling at a certain speed. And when it arrives, you want it to arrive when the piston is at or near bottom dead center, because that's when cylinder filling is the worst. And that's when you get a maximum effectiveness of this charge filling from the reflected wave. So that's RPM specific. And only in a certain amount of time, it's gonna travel and arrive there at the right time. Once you get it too high of RPM, it's too long for the thing to travel, so it's not affected there. On a short runner at higher RPM, it can make that travel and arrive at the right time. So that's all that it is. There's no tuning around that. Christian wants to know, do I have an experience running a dual plane on a blow-through application? Yeah, I ran a single plane versus a dual plane on a blow-through LS application. We ran both of those. And there's no, a dual plane makes more torque than a single plane, NA and boosted. You don't change that from with the presence of positive pressure. Graham wants to know, he's got a 240 or 280Z with a 5.3 and water meth injection. Should I run an air to air or air to water intercooler? Either one of those work. That's more dependent on usually how much room you have and where you can put it. Either one of those work. If they're sized correctly, they both kind of do the same thing. If you can add ice water to it, the air to water can make more power, but you're probably not talking about that. And if you're going to run your water meth, have your water meth go into the intake manifold after the intercooler if you're going to put an intercooler on it. Zip Tie has a Cadillac M122 with a machined adapters for an LS Cathedral or LS3 style head. I had one of those blowers. I ended up selling it. I was going to do a deal for to put it on an LS, but it was more work than I really wanted to do. I didn't want to machine up adapters for it. Tim wants to know, on a Z-Tech with an SVT cylinder head, a GT2871. I'd have to look up the map on the GT2871. Tim might know that particular one. I'm not that fluent on the actual Garrett turbos. Is it capable of 500 wheel horsepower? 2871. That seems, unless I don't know the numbers very well, that seems a little small for 500 wheel horsepower, because that's going to be 600 at the flywheel. But again, I'd have to look it up. Yeah, see, Tim said go to a 3071 or 3576. That's kind of what I was thinking. A 28 seemed a little small to me, but again, I haven't memorized because I don't want to ever use real Garrett turbos because I can't afford them. Jeff wants to know if a Holley Sniper will reduce intake temps like a Holley carb. Yes, it will. If it's a throttle body injection deal, it will reduce charge temperatures because it's introducing fuel. It doesn't seem to do it as well as the carburetor does, interestingly enough, but you're splitting hairs there. Yeah, and it does improve. I mean, it does reduce charge temperature. It works. But if you put an intercooler on it, it works even better. It makes more power even with an intercooler, even on a blow-through carbureted or throttle body application. Yeah, yes, you can run without an intercooler. You can run without an intercooler with anything. I ran my Mustang with a Vortec without an intercooler for years and years and years, and it works just fine. It just doesn't work as good as it does with an intercooler. $28.71 Disco Potato. That's OG. Is a 7.385 and a 7.4 push rod a big difference? It's not really very much. You have more adjustment than that when you're adjusting the push rod. You have much more compression in the push rod than that. I mean, in the lifter than that. For us, when I do it, I don't measure it. What I do is we go to zero lash where the push rod is touching the rocker and the rocker is touching the valve, and then I count the number of turns that it takes to bottom the rocker on the rocker pedestal, and usually between half and 1.5, it will work. So you have a fairly big range there, and if you'll see, I did a test comparing push rod lengths, because what you're doing is depressing the lifter and you're reducing some of the aerated fluid that happens inside a lifter. So you're turning it into kind of a short travel lifter when you put a longer push rod in it. The thing that you don't want to happen is if you have too long of a push rod in there, the lifter will pump up and then it will hold the valve open and then the thing won't start or it won't run. So there's a limit to what you can do there. But we ran, I think, I know we changed it 150 thousandths on the push rod length when we were doing that test. Thomas has a 74 Ford 351. I'm looking to put into a Fox body. What would be the best bang? Take a look at the low dollar turbo setup that I did on the 302, where we just turned a set of either stock exhaust manifolds or shorty headers around and just built the turbo kit from that. That's a really cheap way to do it. That's from way back in the day. Lots of guys have done that. That's very cheap. It's easy to get $150 or $160 turbo for a Fox body, something like that GT45. There are obviously others. You could do a twin kit, 2 little ones, 2 T28s or 2 T3s. You could also do that, just whatever fits in what you're trying to do. So that's pretty simple. Julius wants to see an apples for apples test on a 331 versus a 347. The motor that has more displacement is going to make more power. That's the way that the world works. Tyler wants to talk about the Engine Masters episode when we did the intercooler versus water meth. Why wasn't the timing increased? Because when you do scientific testing, you test one variable at a time. So all we want to do is compare the intercooler versus water meth, using both of those to cool the charge air. We could have turned the timing up on the intercooler as well. There was more safety there that we could have run. The problem with the water meth, as we talked about, is that the distribution was bad in a long runner manifold. It just we needed to have a port injected water meth, I think. And even then, I don't think that water meth works as well as the intercooling does for lowering the charge temperature and making power. I'm not sure that even with a direct port injected water meth that you could make the same power as you can with an intercooler. Karen, I agree. The VS Racing stuff, I've always had good luck. I've run several of their turbos and we've never had any problems with them. But I haven't really had problems even with the CX Racing stuff. I've never had one of their turbos break on me. And those T76s we've had for years and years, and since back in 2010, I think, when we ran the first one. And I just used those not too long ago on the test, and they don't even belong to me anymore. I gave them to another guy and I borrowed them back so that I could use them. And they still work. So we've had good luck with turbos. Francisco, you shouldn't base your push rod length off of what you're reading on forums. You should check it. It's really, like I said, it's really easy to do. Just put the push rod in, put it in the lifter, set the rockers on, adjust it. I use like a nut driver, since that's a 5/16 or an 8mm. I adjust it until there's drag on the push rod, and then put a ratchet on it with an 8mm or a 5/16, and then spin the ratchet around. And how many ever times it spins around, that will determine whether the push rod is too long or too short. If you have to spin it around twice before it bottoms out on the thing, the push rod's too long. If you tighten it and it only goes just a little bit and it's tight, well, then it's too short. You want about a half a turn, and you'll be able to feel it. A half to one full turn is kind of the sweet spot, and it's really easy to check. You only have to check one of them, and then they're all going to be right. Yeah, Julius, everybody used to say don't do a 347 and do the shorter stroke, the 325 or the 331, depending on what bore size you use. And they're talking about side loading on the walls and it ruining the rings and all that stuff. But the reality is none of these guys have their motors in their cars long enough. For a guy that's building a 347 is not going to put it in his Mustang and then drive it for 300,000 miles. That just doesn't happen. I've never seen any sort of definitive test that tells me that motor wears out before the other ones do. Maybe that's possible, but again, none of those guys are going to get to that point. Zach, 93 Cobra AFR 165 is good choice. 327 gears. What cam should I use? I would recommend the same cam I always do. I would put the Extreme Energy 274 cam in, or maybe even a slightly smaller one like a 264 is really good for a driver. Maybe even better than the 274 cam. Although you have enough compression, we lowered the compression on my motor, but that cam works really good. And it made, if you take a look at the video that I have up, you can see what that cam does on a 5-liter with stock heads and a GT40 intake. So it's kind of what you have there, except for the 165 heads are going to help things out a lot. Will said, I saw you mention Speedmaster in one of your videos. What's your opinion on the rotating assemblies? I've tried lots of the Speedmaster rotating assemblies, and we've had good luck, although I always take them down to the machine shop and have them checked to make sure that they're all right. I don't just trust them and put them together. It's a good idea if you're going to be especially a lot of these things we're going to put, 1 million pounds of boost on. And so we want to make sure that they're right. Tyler says the intercooler doesn't clean the inside of your engine or add any octane. It basically creates cooler, denser air with a restriction. I like the thought of water meth. Then more power to you. If you don't listen to what actual testing tells you, then you should do the thing that you want. Jacob says, I have a 302 Windsor 5-liter. I've never built anything before, and I'd like to have my first go on this. Take a look at the channel. There's lots of 302 stuff to tell you what to do. Put ring gap in it. Leave all the stock internals there. Decent heads. The cheap way is to go get GT40 heads from the wrecking yard. Put a cam in it. Put springs in it. There's lots of different intake manifolds you could do. Anything from the Explorer motor that has a GT40 style intake on it. Or there are lots of good, Trick Flow makes a lot of good ones. Lots of good stuff for the 5-liter to choose from. Brad said he feels like the 331 versus the 347 is like the piston speed argument. Yeah, guys will bring that up, not realizing that the piston speeds that they're talking about for either one of those combinations is so far within the safe range that that sort of discussion is non-existent. KJ, I haven't noticed. Do you have any videos testing water meth? I don't know if I have the Engine Masters water meth test video up there or not. I honestly don't know. I can't remember it. I have a lot of videos up now, but we did do a test on it and we ran it comparing it to. I'd actually like to do more water meth testing. That one test isn't enough for me. I'd like to do more of it. I know a lot of guys that use it and have used it successfully and haven't hurt their stuff. So it obviously is working. I just, after seeing the distribution, it just worries me to rely on that. And it worries me that you're not getting even distribution to all the runners. So you're not getting the same amount of cooling and the same amount of octane and the same amount of fuel. So if you're relying it actually for the fueling and not just for cooling the charge temperature, that sort of thing just has me concerned. Mike wants to know if I've ever been testing with a TFS1 cam and a 5-liter. I have. And as a matter of fact, Mike, if you're looking for one, I have one. I have one from a test that we did. So if you're interested in it, send something to my email address. And I have one of those. They work very well. It's a very good mild cam. We normally use the stage 2 because that's the same as the Extreme Energy 274. But for like a daily driver, good performance deal, especially one with a a stock or even an aftermarket head, it would work really good. I agree, Admiral. The key with meth is you inject it into each runner. That's what I was saying. That's the first thing that Dave and I talked about when we did the Engine Masters thing, is that I wanted to do individual port injection with the water meth, and I thought that would obviously help with the distribution. The problem is when you inject the water meth right there, I'm not sure that we get the same charge cooling as we get from injecting it farther away. So you guys can let me know what you think about that. We might be getting in cylinder temperature changes, but we're not getting charge temperature changes. So are those really the same thing? I agree, Tim. I've wanted to do that for a long time, and since we've already drilled a few holes in the intake manifold for testing at least 2 ports, I thought, well, why don't we just drill holes in the rest of them, and that way we have all of them. And it was already a manifold that we didn't care about anyway, so running that would be kind of cool. We have to get some really, really small nozzles to make that work, because obviously if we're injecting in an individual cylinder rather than in front of the throttle body, you have to have really, really small nozzles, and we could turn the pressure down and all that too to get the thing to where it wasn't losing power, because that's what happens a lot of times is when we have the water meth jacked up, then you can actually lose power, and then you have to start trimming it away until you're not losing power anymore. Oh, Will has an X cam with Pro Comp heads. If you have Pro Comp heads, check the springs on them and check the seats on them. Is Lisa drinking all the hydration? Tom, I hope so. I hope she's making me some. I'm a little bit parched here. Tim, I have a couple of 5-liter things. Like I said, I have that Trick Flow. I have that Trick Flow Stage 1 camshaft that we ran a few tests on. If anybody out there is a 2-valve Ford guy, I have a Trick Flow 2-valve intake setup. So if you guys are interested in that, send something to my email address and I can show you. I have that intake manifold. And if you're wanting something to make some serious power, I also have a set of 2-valve cams that are fairly big. They're 252, 256 at 50. So if you got a good set of ported 2-valve heads and need an intake and some cams to really like wick that thing up, these will do that. The Ozman, you shouldn't have to change the pushrod length when you change the cam, regardless of the lift. The only thing that would make you change the pushrod length is the base circle of the cam. That's what's going to determine whether or not you want to change your pushrod length. So let's see. We have a Team B wants to know how many pounds of boost would be safe with the 22 top and 24 second on a 4060 bore piston. It's not really a boost thing. It's a temperature thing, and I go over this all the time. It's not boost versus gap. It's temperature versus gap, and then also the length of time it's at temperature versus gap. For instance, when I ran the Silver State in my Mustang, I was at wide open throttle for 37 or 8 minutes, and a lot of guys don't do that. So we were at boost, at wide open throttle for that long. So if you're going to do that, and there was only 7 or 8 pounds or something back when we did it with no intercooler. We did have a good air intake, a cold air intake on it, but we were at boost for that period of time. So if you don't have enough gap in the rings to put that much temperature in, even at 7 pounds, you could break the piston. If you're running 30 pounds, but you're only doing it for 8 or 10 seconds, maybe it will be okay. And the other thing is, boost isn't the only thing that puts temperature in the rings. It's also back pressure. It's also timing. It's a lot of other things. So they all conspire to, excuse me, conspire to make it problematic for the rings, which is why we have extra gap in them to make sure that they're okay. Daniel wants to see some tests on methanol versus E85. I haven't run a lot of methanol stuff, not straight methanol like M1 or M5. But it does work. I mean, I was helping Mahovitz run one of his motors, which he runs on methanol. I think it was a Supercharge 5.4, and he runs it on methanol, and it can make really good power. I just don't have a lot of experience with it other than those few times. Nick Nasty, you need 2V cams. These are big cams. These aren't like stage 1 or stage 2 cams. These are stage 7. Nick, yes, I have checked the power differences at running the motor at various temperatures, and the hotter the water is, the less power it makes. Now, it does like having hot oil. So the ideal thing is cold water and hot oil, and sometimes it's hard to get those two, but that's ideal. BDS performance, ring gap on a NA pump fuel application is not as critical. And that's why they show you when you buy rings, if you open up the sheet, the information, I know the instructions, everyone throws that away. But if you take a look at it, they'll give you specific ring gaps for different applications. So it'll go from 4 or 5 thousandths, let's say, per inch of bore down to 7 or 8 thousandths, depending on how much load and temperature and boost and stuff that you're putting in it. And so that's kind of where all that stuff comes from. Obviously, the ring manufacturers know way more than I do. We just, when we were doing the Big Bang stuff, we just put lots of ring gap in it. I tell people 28 to 30. Some of them were 35 or 37. I mean, I just didn't even care after some point. I just wanted to make sure that I had enough. And we were trying to break the motor anyway, so it really didn't, it really wasn't going to make a difference. Yeah, methanol, Julius said the guys in Australia run meth on the big burnout vehicles, and it does help cool them. And you see that on guys that run, I'll tell you, the Roots blowers really like it. They like E85, they like methanol, and you can see condensation in the blower because it unfortunately displaces some of the airflow of the blower, but it does help cool it, and it likes it, and they make a lot of power. Hello? Is a trick flow type R. So one of those is an import, and one of those is a domestic. The trick flow R manifold is not one that I recommend for a daily driver. You want a street burner or something like that has longer runners in it. The Ozman, always say hello. See, he's polite. Yep, Tim, an 871 can have discharge temperatures above 300 degrees. But usually when you're running fuel through them, which you would if you have carburetors on top of them, even with fuel, it's hard to get it that high unless the thing is really, really wicked up. If you have no fuel flowing through them, it's really easy to get to that temperature. If you have E85 going through them, you can drop temperature a lot. And then if you have meth going through them, it's even better. Goldie's Garage, you recently said some great things about the performance of a 351 Cleveland. Any thoughts about doing a turbo? Somebody asked me to do a turbo on one of those, and the ones that we saw all the time were in the Panteras. All the Pantera guys had twin turbo 351 Clevelands in their Panteras. I didn't see a lot of them running around or doing burnouts in them or anything. And maybe they certainly look cool because everything was polished and chromed and all of that stuff. But a 351 Cleveland would do the same thing that Windsors do and everything else. If they make good power NA and we add boost to them, then they make good power with boost. That's what they do. I ran the 351 Cleveland with a Paxton supercharger with a Novi 2000. That thing worked out really good. It made really good power. So with turbos, it will do the same thing. But a turbo Cleveland would be kind of cool. Lots of guys in Australia running turbo Clevelands. Yeah, I agree. I think that until the LS3 came out, the Cleveland head was probably had the highest flow of any factory small block style head. If you call the LS a small block too, a Cleveland head flows way more than any of the cathedral port LS heads, just not as much as the LS3 head. And the Cleveland head flowed a lot more than any of the original small block heads or the original small block Ford heads or any of the Dodge heads, any of those. I mean, it flowed 275. So there was nothing until the LS3, I think, that I know of, that flowed what that Cleveland head flows. And they made a lot of power. Admiral says, be careful between a 185 and a 195. The 185s are going to be better NA and the 195s are going to be better for boost. I would 100% disagree with that. If you look at the video that I did, I don't know, I think the video's up. I know we did the test. I ran 170s, 195s, 210s, and 225s. I ran them on a 302 and on a 363. And we ran into a situation where we didn't need what the 225s could do. But the thing is, it didn't really hurt power. So I don't, if you take a look at, like, again, we use the LS stuff. If you look at the LS stuff, we always worried about, oh, you can't put a 205 airflow head on a 302. Well, sure you can. It's probably not going to make any more power than the 185 does, but it's probably not going to hurt you because we all worried about too much port volume and all that stuff. And that's why I wanted to do that port volume test. I don't think it really hurts you. I don't think, especially a 195 on the small block, we run 195 stuff all the time on things. And I don't think you'd see a difference between a 185 and a 195. And the 195, the reason I like having something like that is because it gives you then room to grow if you want to make more power. Do I think a turbo Windsor could be useful for towing? Yeah, you can. The thing that becomes critical on trying to do a turbo combination for towing is the tune becomes ultra critical, especially if you have the thing loaded for a long time. So you have to worry about two things. You have to worry about the tune, and then you also have to worry about heat management, which is very important on these combinations. Pushrod versus Josh wants to know pushrod versus modular, which is superior for power and reliability. I don't know why that's even important. In the testing that we've looked at, people are talking about a non-PI head and a PI head and then the trick flow head. The trick flow head is a lot better than both of those. Not just a little bit, it's a lot better.
It's better than even than a ported PI head, and it's head and shoulders above a non-ported PI head. I was after these guys for years and years. Every video that I did, or not, in every story that I wrote, even when I was doing editorial and stuff for Muscle Mustangs and Fast Swords, I kept telling people, look, somebody in the aftermarket has to build an aftermarket 2-valve head. They made more than a million small block or Fords with this 4.6 2-valve, and somebody has to build an aftermarket head. And finally, TrickFlow did, and it's a good head, and it's a lot better than the factory stuff. I know that when we were doing ported PI heads, they would flow maybe 235 or so, maybe 240 on a really, really good one. A ported TrickFlow head flows a lot more than that. Man with a plan, what heads do you think are good with an E303 cam? Lots of good heads out there. The regular as-cast TrickFlow heads are very good. Anything that AFR offers is good. The Edelbrock stuff is good. That's a mild cam, so you can get away with lots of different heads. Lots of good head choices for that. Yep, no diesel. I had a diesel. We did chassis dyno testing with it, but not on the engine dyno. I think if you guys are arguing about what's better, a Coyote or LS, you're kind of missing the point. If you're arguing push rods versus non-push rods, or 4-valve versus 2-valve, or boosted versus NA, or any other argument, it's just silly. One Trick Pony, when do you go past 80 thousandths wall thickness on push rods? Honestly, I've never done that. We've run all of our stuff with 80. I have some 120 stuff, and I did a test going from 80 thousandths push rods to 120 thousandths push rods, and we didn't see anything. I obviously, we're not looking at it through a scope or a high-speed camera to see if there's actually deflection, but we didn't see anything on the dyno. We didn't measure any power. Now, I know that if you would go way up in spring rate, that might be necessary, but we're not running these motors to 9 or 10,000 RPM, and we're not remachining the head to put 500 pounds of seat pressure on these springs. That's when you would start getting deflection, and then you'd also start to work into RPM frequency and stuff too. But in the testing that we did in the RPM range that we normally run, I didn't see anything going from an 80 to a 120 wall push rod. Yeah, the guys are talking about the 2-valve Ford. You can make a lot of power with them. We've made 450 NA with them with ported PI heads, and we've run boost on them and made over 1,000 horsepower. So it's not 2-valve or 4-valve. It's just that horsepower NA versus horsepower under boost. They all do the same thing. It doesn't matter whether it's a 500-inch Cadillac or a 455 Buick. You just start with the NA power, and then you add boost to that, and it multiplies it, and they all do that. Have you ever tuned, Rick Rowe, have you ever tuned a modified J series? I have not, but I'm going to get one. I'm going to get a 32 or a 35, and we're going to run it on the dyno because I definitely want to do that. We definitely want to run boost on it. We've run, the guys over at West Tech have done tuning on a number of them on the chassis dyno, usually on sand rails and stuff, and they're pretty popular and they work fairly well. Yeah, Tim, the Windsor Indy heads reverse flow with the exhaust incenters. Those are really cool looking. Duntoff had some Chevys like that, and they've all experimented with those. It's kind of cool stuff. Sean wants to know if I found pump gas with octane additive just as effective as racing fuel at the same octane level? I have not. I have not seen, and we had guys that work for Unical test octane boosters for us, and the octane booster actually made this much difference in the actual octane of the fuel. So, and we tested 5 or 6 of them, I think. And so the octane booster thing didn't really work very well, at least not according to their testing. We don't run, I may throw a can of octane booster in there in a 91 octane deal, just as a small hedge. And I think more just to make me feel better than anything else. But I would never do that. Like I wouldn't run 91 with octane booster versus E85 or versus 100 octane, because I just don't think you get the same thing. Jason wants to know what size valve springs are good for an NA 2nd gen LT1. The little Z28 spring is good for like small lift stuff. And then you just have to decide. It's a small block Chevy head, so you have to look at it and decide what kind of springs you could put in. And you have to size the spring so that it doesn't coil bind in the lift range that you're running for your camshaft, and then determine what kind of RPM range you're running. It's a hydraulic roller cam, so it's fairly heavy. You have to have enough spring rate. Normally, we would want to see something in the, 170 or so on the seat, and then 400 or more open. And it could go as high as 200, and 400 is kind of a good range. But we've run stuff down as low as 150. Again, it depends on if you run that LT1. Some guys use the LS stuff. So if you run a beehive spring and you have a small retainer, you can get away with more or less spring rate and more RPM because you have reduced the valve train mass. It's all trick stuff. Driver Mod Racing, have you ever played with a Toyota 7M engine? I have not. I like those super motors. Those are the OG super motors. Those are cool. But I've not done one. I don't even think I don't think I've ever even run one of those on the engine or on the chassis dyno. Oh, that's right. Tim, the Saturn SUV has a Honda J35. I forgot about that. I'll have to look when I'm looking at the wrecking yard. I'll have to go look over there. I got about 1 more minute, and then I got to get going. Unity Motorsports, you ran a 2-valve that made 600 NA. That's pretty impressive. Is it a big motor? Did you start off with a 5.4 or something? .304-inch, okay. BDS Performance. See, 3:30 a.m. in UK. See, that's what I call dedication. I like it. And is the 304-inch on the taller deck height? Is it on the 5.4 block? Okay, who's going to get the last question? 4:30 in Norway. See, my fellow Norwegians. I have family there. Okay, Luke, you got the last question. How much tuning do you have to do when you go from an NA motor to a turbo motor? Well, when we do it on the dyno, if I always try to run the motor NA first. So we run the motor NA, and I don't tune everything. I only tune the idle, the transition, and then the wide open throttle. And then we interpolate everything else, and so that the graph looks pretty if anybody looks at it. And then we, what I do is I'll take the top 2 in the NA, and we'll copy those and we'll paste them up at the top of whatever boost we're running. and we'll double those, and then we'll interpolate everything from that down to the NA one. And then we have a fairly smooth curve. And then what I do is we'll go in and load the motor, let's say at 3,000 RPM, and it's, let's say, at 7 pounds of boost. We've obviously taken away timing also. So the same thing, if we have a curve going from 22 degrees up to 29 degrees, and then it will reduce all the way up as we go up in boost. So that will take care of itself. We'll interpolate all that, and then we'll do a load in. We'll go, okay, 3,000 RPM at, if it's, let's say, at 7 pounds of boost, and we'll load it in. Oh, it's 11.9. Okay, we're going to add a little bit of fuel to that, and then we'll try a quick load at 3,500. Go, okay, it's 11.5. It's happy there. And then we'll make a short sweep and go from 3,000 to 4,500 or 5,000, assuming that it's safe. And it goes, okay, yeah, it's 11.8 here. And so, it's doing what it's supposed to do. And we'll go in and make minor trims. If it's if we load into it and it's 13 to 1, we go, oh, okay, well, then I'll go in and add, 10 or 15% fuel all the way through the whole thing, just to make sure it's safe. I want it to be rich when I load in, and then we want to take fuel away is the ideal situation. So that's how I do the tuning when I'm on the dyno, and it seems to work pretty well. I'd rather be conservative and then have a motor and then take fuel away than not have a motor and have to take the motor off the dyno, which obviously doesn't work. Thanks, guys, for showing up. We will try to be back on tomorrow. I'm gonna do it again at 6 o'clock. We're gonna try to do it earlier and not 7 because that works better for us. Oh, in Qatar, nice, awesome. God, you guys are all over tonight. Unity, I want to hear more about that 2-valve. That's super cool. That's big power stuff. I got to get going, guys. We will see you tomorrow.